discuss this now with Abdullah Al-Arian. He's an analyst with Al-Shabaka, the Palestinian Policy Network, and joins us from Doha. Abdullah, good to have you on the program. Do you think there is a shift in the response that we're now hearing from the United States? No call for a ceasefire, but a strong call for Israel to refrain from attacks on hospitals.
Well, I think there's certainly a recognition on the part of the United States that there's mounting criticism and condemnation coming from so many different quarters. We're talking about mass protest movements that have erupted across Europe, across North America, in Washington itself. And I think that at the very least, this is paying lip service to that. But I think these fall far, far short from what we would expect to see. There's still no call for a ceasefire. And certainly these words don't carry with them any kind of action, right? That we're still seeing very much the exact same commitment to sending a massive $14 billion aid package. We're still seeing the rearmament of Israel, which of course is relying on American weapons in terms of all of the atrocities that it's currently committing in Gaza. We're also still seeing the exact same language in terms of this idea of the right to self-defense, which of course does not really make sense in a situation in which Israel is the occupying power, in which it's the one that's besieging an unarmed population, essentially, is what we're seeing with the 2.3 million residents in Gaza. And so I think ultimately all of this falls incredibly short, and we're not seeing it being backed by any kind of action.
What kind of action would the United States need to take in order for Israel to change the way that it's operating in Gaza right now? Would it have to be something where the United States cuts off that aid, even though at the moment that aid has been approved by Congress?
Well, certainly. I mean, I think for one thing, we've seen the U.S. use its veto power in the UN Security Council. When other nations have come together and called for a ceasefire, the U.S. has prevented this from happening. And so at the very least, to not allow for the veto power to be used. And then certainly, I think the idea of halting aid, halting the sales of weapons. I mean, there's a number of measures. And we know, of course, how close the relationship is between the U.S. and Israeli leadership. We've seen that from the very beginning. The U.S. leadership, when it visited with the Israeli leaders, were there in the planning room when the military strategy was being worked out, which means that they're very much a party to all of the events that have been unfolding, including the many catastrophic massacres and the humanitarian disaster that's unfolding. And so in that sense, the U.S. is very much in a position to be able to make its voice heard and to see that Israeli actions are halted.
Of course, the EU is also concerned that this conflict is going to spread to the wider region, especially if Hezbollah gets more involved. Could you see this happening?
Well, I think, this really comes down to the escalation that we're seeing in Gaza. I think in terms of the ground invasion, in terms of the mass exodus of people from their homes, I mean, this has always been defined as a kind of red line. The idea that there's going to be some tipping point at which we might actually see a wider involvement and participation of other groups and parties. Chiefly, of course, Hezbollah has been kind of at the forefront of that in terms of people's analysis. But I don't know necessarily that we've reached that point. And certainly the confrontations militarily on the northern borders of Israel with Lebanon have been quite limited in scale, especially when we consider what's happening in Gaza, that most of the focal point continues to be there. I think there is a fear, certainly, with Hezbollah's involvement that this could potentially expand to include a country that's backing it in Iran. And of course, the United States, which has, of course, sent its own aircraft carriers into the Mediterranean and has signaled that it is also not beyond the idea of engaging militarily directly and not just through its support of Israel.
Abdullah Al-Arian in Doha, thank you so much for your analysis.